Hi everyone, my name is Michelle. I'm a student at the University of Alberta, and I'm working on Review Board through the CANOSP 2021 program. My project this semester is to create a setting for mapping file extensions to syntax highlighters for diffs. So when we look at diffs on Review Board, we can see that the files in the diffs have syntax highlighting. So these Python files all have Python syntax highlighting. And to apply this syntax highlighting, we use a third-party library called Pigments. So what we would do previously is we would use this function, guessLexer for file name, to guess what lexer, which is the syntax highlighting class in Pigments, we would guess what lexer to use for a file given its file name and the data in the file. And what was happening is sometimes this guess would be wrong, and we would return the wrong lexer class and end up with the wrong syntax highlighting. So to avoid that, we're adding a setting for custom Pigments lexers. So this is just a mapping that maps file extensions to lexer classes. So in the default, we just have the .less files mapped to the less CSS lexer class. And how this gets applied is in the code for applying Pigments. We first check the mapping to see if the file name's extension exists in the mapping. And if so, we'll try to grab the lexer class that that file extension is mapped to. And if that lexer class exists, we'll just use that lexer to apply the highlighting. If the lexer class does not exist, then we will log an error to let the users know that that lexer does not exist or could not be found. Now, if an extension is not defined in this custom Pigments lexers mapping, we'll just revert to the old behavior of guessing the lexer for the file name. Now, to see this in action, we'll define a new mapping of Python files and we'll do markdown. We'll map it to the markdown lexer class. So this should apply markdown syntax highlighting. So take note of what this particular file looks like. It has Python syntax highlighting right now. But if I reload the page, we should see that that file now has markdown syntax highlighting. So that is how the custom Pigments lexers mapping is applied. And then I will just go over some tests that I created to make sure that the mapping works as expected. So this first test just maps the markdown files to the less CSS lexer class. So given this data, it should, after running it through the syntax highlighter, it should pop out like this, which is just a string of less CSS syntax highlighting applied to the data. So that's the first test. And then the second test is to check that when a user maps to a non-existent class, that we are in fact logging the correct error. So this is the error that you would get if you mapped a .less file extension to a non-existent class.